The key question is, what combination of factors produce the outbreak of revolutions? The Pope's reforms in 1848 and early 1849 set an example to other states and their rulers. In Piedmont and Tuscany, press censorship was abolished, and proposals were made for a joint customs union with the Papal States. Even Austrian-controlled Lombardy became restless, worrying Metternich, who acted swiftly to preserve Austrian control in northern Italy by making new treaties with Modena and Parma, and by strengthening the Austrian garrison. There was a chorus of discontent in Italy that was becoming even louder. Liberals were calling for constitutions, government reforms, and political freedom, while nationalists demanded independence from Austria and some measure of Italian unity. The situation became more acute owing to economic problems. About 90% of the population of Italy worked on the land, and the Italian economy was based almost entirely on agriculture. There was little industry in the north and almost none in the south of the country. When the harvests failed in 1846 and 1847, problems multiplied not only for the peasants but also for those in towns. Shortages of wheat and corn meant high prices, wages did not rise to meet the increased cost, and peasants and others could not afford to feed their families. The result was an outbreak of revolution. Problems became acute first in Sicily, where Ferdinand II, King of Naples, had initially offered a better life for Sicilians by making reforms and appointing a viceroy to see that the reforms were carried out. These did not last, and a period of repression coinciding with an outbreak of cholera left Sicilians in a desperate state. In January 1848, notices were posted up in Palermo, the island's capital. Sicilians, the time for prayers is past. Peaceful protests and demonstrations have all been useless. Ferdinand, King of Naples, has treated them all with contempt, and we, as people born free, are loaded with chains and reduced to misery. Shall we still delay claiming our lawful rights? To arms, sons of Sicily, our united force will be invincible. The notice went on to explain that weapons would be handed out to those who came to the main public square at dawn 3 days later. The authorities could not really believe that a revolution was being announced in advance, but they took no chances and arrested a few likely suspects. On the day announced, the streets were full of people, but whether they were ordinary sightseers or revolutionaries is impossible to say. After what arms were available had been handed out, there were clashes with the government troops. The next day, peasants from the outside the city arrived to join in the rising. The Neapolitan army retaliated by shelling the city, and they were joined 2 days later by 5,000 reinforcements. They found, though, that the revolutionaries had successfully taken over Palermo and were demanding a restoration of the famous 1812 Constitution that had been abolished by the King of Naples in 1816. A compromise was offered. It was refused. Fighting continued, and by April, the revolutionaries had taken over most of the island. A provisional government was set up with the help of middle-class moderates who were becoming anxious about the peasants and what they might do next. A civic guard was formed to control the masses who were marching on towns and villages, destroying property, freeing prisoners, and burning tax collection records. A parliament was elected, and it declared that Naples and Sicily were finally totally separated and divided, and that the King of Naples was no longer the King of Sicily. The Sicilians' aim was, as always in 1848 as in 1820, to free themselves from Naples. They were not concerned with national unity, quite the opposite. Theirs was a separatist movement with the aim of breaking away from Naples and making Sicily independent. On the mainland, the revolution spread to Naples within a few days of the uprising in Palermo. A huge demonstration demanded a constitution. The king agreed to a two-chamber parliament with limited powers. He also agreed to form a national guard and to free the press from censorship. Nevertheless, peasant grievances over their right to use common land led to fighting, in which Ferdinand's troops were successful. By September 1848, the government in Naples was able to send troops to retake Sicily. The Sicilians were defeated after an intense bombardment of local towns, which earned Ferdinand the nickname King Bomba, and by the spring of 1849, the Sicilians were forced to accept reunification with Naples. There the king had already gone back on his earlier promises, abolished Parliament, and replaced it with absolute rule and a police state. In the rest of Italy, other serious disturbances were occurring in 1848. As a result, the Grand Duke of Tuscany and the King of Piedmont promised to grant constitutions. Their example was soon followed by the Pope in the Papal States. But in Modena and Parma, the rulers had to leave their states and flee for their lives. Trouble also started in Milan, in Austrian-controlled Lombardy. It began as a tobacco boycott. Tobacco was an Austrian state monopoly, and the people of Milan believed that if they stopped smoking, then Austrian finances would be seriously affected. The sight of Austrian soldiers smoking in public was an excuse for attacking them, and small-scale fights quickly turned into larger riots and eventually into a full-scale revolution known as the 5 Days, March 17th through the 22nd. The commander-in-chief of the Austrian forces in Italy, the 81-year-old General Radetzky, decided to withdraw from the city, not because he was defeated, but because the situation in Austria had changed dramatically. Revolution had broken out in Vienna, and Metternich had resigned. The provincial government set up in Milan by the revolutionaries prepared to continue the fight against Austria. They decided to ask for help from the neighboring state of Piedmont, whose king, Charles Albert, had just granted a constitution to his people. A week later, Charles Albert agreed to declare war on Austria. In the other Austrian-controlled state, Venetia, a small-scale revolt persuaded the Austrians to surrender, and the independent Venetian Republic of St. Mark was proclaimed in March 1849. Its rapidly elected assembly voted for union with Piedmont. At first, all went well with Charles Albert. His army defeated the Austrians at the end of May of 1848. But in the Papal States, things were not going so well. The Pope's army commander had disobeyed orders and set off with his troops to join Charles Albert's army. This made difficulties for the Pope, who was not at war with Austria. He decided to keep out of the war, and to make his position clear, issued an allocution, an official policy speech made to senior clerics, in which he said this: "Seeing that some at the present desire that we too, along with the other princes of Italy and their subjects, should engage in war against the Austrians, we have thought it suitable to proclaim clearly and openly in this our solemn assembly that such a measure is altogether alien from our counsels. We cannot refrain from disassociating ourselves from the treacherous advice published in journals and in various works of those who want the Roman Pope to be the head of and to provide over some sort of novel republic of the whole Italian people. On this occasion, we do urgently warn the Italian people to have no part in these proposals, which would be ruinous to Italy, but live in loyalty to their sovereigns, whose good will they have already experienced, and to never let themselves be torn away." Pius IX made it clear not only that he would not join in the war against Austria, but also that he was no longer interested in becoming the head of an Italian federation of states, or even in the idea of the Church leading support for a united Italy. 2 years earlier, the Pope had blessed Italy. He now withdrew his blessing. The Church had turned its back on liberalism and gone over to the side of reaction and absolutism. For Charles Albert and other loyal Catholics, the loss of papal support for their cause was a bitter blow. They would have to choose between following their political principles and obeying their spiritual leader. It was a difficult decision, but many decided in favor of their political principles. As a result, the liberal and nationalist movements became noticeably anti-clerical. In June 1848, General Ratsky arrived from Austria with reinforcements, and in July, Charles Albert's army was defeated by the Austrian at Catuzza. An armistice was signed, and Piedmont withdrew from Lombardy, leaving it in Austrian hands. The Venetians hurriedly canceled their recently completed union with Piedmont, re-established the former Republic of St. Mark, and prepared to continue the war with Austria. Here's a chart of the revolutions of 1848 and 49. You can see that the causes were liberalism, nationalism, and economic discontent. Success was almost everywhere at first. Had the Pope gone a different way, who knows? But in the end, there was many failures, and after all, only Piedmont will continue to have their constitution. And just at this moment, as these revolutions failed in Piedmont in June 1848, Mazzini arrived back in Italy after long years of exile. The War of the Princes against Austria had failed. Now it was time for the War of the People.